Welcome to the Caribbean Cricket Podcast, your one-stop shop for all things West Indies cricket. By the fans, for the fans. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to episode 76 of the Caribbean Cricket Podcast. My name is Mashal St. Patrick Hewitt, and I'm one half of the Caribbean Cricket Podcast. And with me as ever is my partner in crime, Santoki Nagulendran. Santoki, how you doing?
Yes, it's been a long time, Mashal, since we've done a Caribbean Cricket Podcast episode. For those of you listening to audio who are wondering where have these two got to, we've been over on 99.94 DM doing reactions to West Indies World Cup campaign, doing quick reactions to everything going on in West Indies cricket. So we'll probably put a link in this video and if you're listening on the audio, search for 99.94 DM if you want more regular content, short 30-minute videos looking at current affairs in West Indies cricket. But Mash, we'd always say we use the Caribbean Cricket Podcast to deep dive and delve into long-form topics that people want to hear, you know, big discussions that the fans want us to kind of look into. And it's no different today. We're tackling a big issue in West Indies cricket, and we've got a very special guest from Cricket West Indies on, don't we, Mash?
We do indeed. And as you say, Santoki, we make it a mission of having the conversations that need to be had, but more importantly, like you say, with the key stakeholders. And our guest today, as I give him the big lengthy intro, I think sometimes all the time in West Indies cricket, I think a lot of assumptions, presumptions, half-truths are said about what actually goes on in West Indies cricket. And I don't think enough in-depth conversations are had with some of the stakeholders to try and just get to the kind of nitty-gritty of what it's truly like to kind of run an operation like Cricket West Indies in the modern global context. And so we're delighted to have with us today Dominic Warne, the Commercial and Marketing Director of Cricket West Indies. And some will listen to this and be like, you've got the Commercial and Marketing Director on. Why is that so important? But if you really follow West Indies cricket, it's actually very important, certainly in the context, like I said, the global game of cricket. So without any further ado, let me bring on Mr. Warne and introduce him to the fans. Yes, Dominic, how are you doing?
Very well, thank you. Good to see you both. Thanks for having me on.
Most definitely. You're currently, of course, or you reside in Antigua. How are you finding the Super 50 at the moment?
It's I think for us, I mean, we're pretty happy with the competitive level. As always, you're wanting to try and see, it's probably a better quality of pitches. You want to see some good performances. And I think for us with the Super 50 in particular, you're trying to see who are the players that are going to push through and push for selection, particularly with next year being a sort of World Cup year for the 50 over format. And I think I'm sure we'll get onto the World Cup and the implications of that a little bit anyway. But, fundamentally, you've got a new generation of players, quite young in experience terms, not necessarily in terms of age terms across both the men's and women's game. And I think the one thing that the West Indies has always had has been real heroes, especially in the men's game with the legacy and the history going back. And probably that's a little bit of a weak point at the moment, which is it's hard for fans to get really into their teams if you haven't got heroes that have consistently put in big performances. I mean, it's great to see the likes of Alec Athanaze do well because he's been around at the youth level, been at the World Cups, and has been talked about for some time. So back-to-back centuries is great, but at the same time, he hasn't done anything in the 3 or 4 games since, and you're not looking to him to get 6 centuries in a row. But for fans to get into it, I think, as we all know, whatever sport it is, you want to see your heroes and you want to see 2 or 3 in a team leading. So, I mean, it's good for the competition that Leewards are doing well. You'd expect Trinidad to do well with the strength of their squad, even though they've lost a few to the test team who are going out to Australia. So I think it's really who's pushing for the runner-up places in each group, really, at the moment. The Trinidad zone's a little bit more competitive in terms of probably 3 teams pushing for 2 places. So next week it all comes down to the crunch with the semi-finals and the final, and hopefully we'll have a few people putting extra pressure into the squad to look into the ODI selection for 2023, because it's going to be a busy year in 2023.
Santolki, did you pick up there how Dominic didn't want to call Jamaica or Guyana? What's going on?
Every time I call Jamaica, they lose. Every time I call Guyana, they lose. So they're both up and down at the moment. But I think it's really interesting with both of them. I think Jamaica have actually got some really good talent in there, and you saw some of the players in the CPL actually did really, really well. And Guyana, I mean, I know it's the bane of the Guyanese that Guyana have been pushing and haven't quite crossed the finishing line, especially in the Super 50 over the last few years. So I'm trying to sit on the fence just so that neither of you get too hostile to me.
Yeah, a lot of people might think it's been a long wait for Guyana to win the CPL title, but we actually haven't won the Super 50 in 17 years, so it's been a long time coming. But Dominic, you've been in a role as a commercial and marketing director for just over 5 years now, I believe, for Cricket West Indies.
That's right.
Let's take it back before then. What sort of attracted you to the job in terms of working with Cricket West Indies?
I mean, from the personal side, I mean, I'm a big sports fan anyway. Love cricket. Fortunate to grow up in just a state school playing cricket in England, and actually grew up following the likes of Eldine Baptiste, who resides here in Antigua. And of course, as we all know, growing up in the UK back in the 80s, 70s and 80s for me, cricket, you pretty much had two West Indies fans, two West Indies players in every team. So for fans, if you're watching Somerset with Viv and Joel Garner, or you're watching Hampshire with Malcolm Marshall, or Middlesex with Desmond Haynes, there were just West Indies players everywhere. And, I went to a few test matches to see England get royally shellacked, to use an Australian term. And I mean, it was brutal, but it was amazing. And so that's on the personal side. And I'm, my role here is split into sort of marketing and commercial, and I've done both of those roles, but especially from the marketing side, also really intrigued in the West Indies story, which is huge, and I think pretty much unique in sport. You can look at the British Lions in terms of how they come together for rugby, but for me, there's this incredible story, which I would say still now and historically, Cricket West Indies and what was West Indies Cricket Board haven't really tapped into, especially internationally, which is you've got this amazing story of teams consistently beating up the world against the odds with limited resources, with based on pretty much grit, determination, and a desire to stick it to everybody else. And to generate that talent with such limited resources, particularly if you contrast to England and Australia, and especially now with India. I mean, it's just a wonderful, wonderful sports story. And, I get a little bit romantic that if you look at the likes of Ferrari and F1 and the ups and downs it's had, the Green Bay Packers in NFL, the likes of the Leicester City story, in the Premier League. I just think sports stories are incredible, and even more so here, because fundamentally cricket is the region's game, and it matters. It matters for so many reasons, and so it's a real privilege. But also, I suppose, finally, I just think professionally, looking on it, and I still think we've got a great opportunity to get more commercially, to invest back into cricket in the West Indies. And don't get me wrong, it's a tough ask, and it is a tough ask in the world, whichever sport you're in. But without that story, it would be very, very difficult. But with that story, it's a great, great opportunity.
So, Dominic, I mean, as Santolki says, you've been involved for five years now, and I think you are actually. Do you know what? I'll give you some credit, because you are quite open on social media in terms of Twitter. You'll answer fans' questions. You'll try to be as transparent as you possibly can be with regards to key questions. But I think Santoki and I, when we've kind of individually, whichever one of us has been on the Caribbean Cricket Podcast handle at any one point in time, I think the number one question that most people would pose in the context of your role is, well, no, let me take that back. It's not a question. I think it's the issue that comes up the most is possibly a lack of understanding of the challenges that West Indies and by extension Cricket West Indies would face in a commercial and marketing sense. So I guess what would be the easiest way for you to explain the challenges we might face versus some of the quote unquote superpowers in the world game?
Yeah, I think I want to keep this engaging and interesting, not go too much into theory and everything else. But I look at it, the best way of looking at West Indies is that we've got three audiences. And fundamentally, your audience and your fan base determines how successful you are. And it doesn't matter about commercials. It just means in terms of getting people into the stadium, who's going to buy books, who's going to buy shirts, how many people are going to watch on TV, because that's where the money comes from. And listen, none of us forget here that before 30, 40 years ago, most sport wasn't commercialised at all, but people watched for the love of it, and it grew because of the love and the fan base you got and the volunteers you had and everything else. And it has changed very quickly in a short period of time. But we've got three audiences. Number one, the home audience in the Caribbean, whichever stat you look at most, you've got a population of 5 to 6 million people. Cut that in half, whether it's by gender for the teams or just say, look, roughly half are going to be interested in cricket. You're assuming that half of your population of everyone from age 1 to 100 is going to be following cricket. You can probably therefore cut that in half again, and you're immediately down to sort of 1.25 million, for example. So that's really, that's really what you're looking for in terms of your home audience. Now, if you contrast that to England, for example, and I used to be the marketing director for NatWest, which supported cricket in the UK for a long time. I think they still do to some degree. We knew that in the UK, approximately 20 million people followed cricket regularly. So you've immediately got a 15 to 20-fold difference in terms of audience numbers, which if you take that into people watching on TV, buying shirts, buying tickets, you immediately see the discrepancy, or not the discrepancy, the variance between them. The flip side is we've got an incredible number of people around the world who follow West Indies far more than they follow other international teams. So India, England, Australia, South Africa, pretty much all the international teams love the West Indies. And we've all heard the phrase, everyone's second favourite team. And it's true. And I think, therefore, there is a massive opportunity, probably much more weighted to India because of the size of the population. And then the third one is just sports fans. Now, if you do that for a Premier League club or for an NFL team, you're doing it in reverse. So if you're Manchester, you're in a population, you're in a home population of 60 million, but there's 3 or 4 million people living around Manchester, similar demographics to the West Indies. But the actual home country population is massive before you go on to the rest of the world. And that's probably the best way to look at the challenge, which is the one thing we do know that West Indies fans are pretty much the most passionate fans in cricket. We did a big research piece on it in 2018. And it comes with all the cuss outs and the fickleness and everything that comes with it. But that's what sport's all about, isn't it? It's passion and opinion. And, and with a story like the West Indies, it's even sharper and more accentuated. So we're trying to flip it on its head. And if I, excuse me for using lots of sports analogies, but if you look at something like New Zealand rugby and also New Zealand cricket, what New Zealand rugby have done is very similar to what we want to be doing, which is they know the passion of rugby in New Zealand, but the rest of the world looks to New Zealand for rugby. England, France, Japan, Australia, South Africa, etc. And so it's very similar. And then if you actually look at the commercial side, that what New Zealand cricket have been doing, they've done an incredible job as New Zealand have turned around their cricket completely from the playing side, the government side, the fixtures side, and the commercial side in the last 7 or 8 years. So there are some parallels there. The only thing that is different, which makes it more challenging for us, is just the cost of running cricket. So the cost of running cricket here means you have to drive greater revenues just to break even and stand still. And again, when I used to do the NatWest cricket in the UK, if you had 3 test matches and 5 ODIs, you were literally in a truck driving around for 8 weeks. And here it's, planes, boats and trucks and customs and everything else. And it just puts a huge burden onto your cost base as well as your resource base, and just risk, because anything can go wrong. The amount of times we've been ringing customs officers 24 hours before a game asking for help from our territorial board partners or from prime ministers it's very regular. And so that's just the nature of island life, I suppose, isn't it? That, it throws up its logistics. So I know there's loads more I can talk about that, but that's probably covers a few of the key things we have to consider.
And you touched on a key word with West Indies cricket during that talk, cuss outs, synonymous with the West Indian fan base. Now, we one question which a lot of fans wanted to know is, obviously throughout this year, West Indies have played particular series without a main sponsor on their shirt. Now, it'd be good for you to sort of clarify, is that a reflection of the times we're in post-COVID pandemic and sort of the hit in the economic reality of things? Or is it linked to sort of the performances in recent years of West Indies, particularly in the T20 and ODI arena? Or is it just a combination of both? How would you sort of explain that? Because to a lot of fans, I guess, it would seem baffling that West Indies as an international side are playing without a sponsor.
Yeah, I mean, it is a challenge for us. It's something we're really aware of, because it's the most visual and visible part of the team for the men and the women in the age group teams when they're on the pitch. And I think it's easy to get defensive on these, and I'll try not to. I think that we had a wonderful partner in Sandals, and Sandals is really a great fit for the West Indies. And if I just give you a little bit on the strategy before I answer that question, which is coming back to what I was saying about our audiences, the way we're trying to use West Indies for the region is actually saying, look, to all the countries and governments and to the fans, of course, is that we think West Indies is not just a driver for your passions and your hopes and just your everyday, hopefully when we're winning. But we also see it as a great export opportunity, which is how can we work with Caribbean companies and businesses and tourist boards to promote the best of the Caribbean to the rest of the world. And that could be hot sauces and rums and insurance and, holiday resorts and everything else. I think that's what we're trying to do. So Sandals was a great fit because actually both it's bringing people in and actually it's exporting the best of the Caribbean to the rest of the world. Unfortunately, like everyone, they got pummeled during COVID and had to shut, if not all of their resorts, pretty much most of them. And it's been a tough road back for them. I think they're doing quite well, and hopefully we'll look at new conversations. But they've had changes of strategy and changes of personnel, so these things happen. But they were very, very happy with the partnership. And actually, it was probably the biggest partnership they ever did with us because they'd worked with us over the course of 20, 25 years. To come back to the case in point, I think we actually had a lot of momentum going into COVID on the broadcast side and sponsors. We actually did probably better than other boards relatively in the cricket world and in other sports. We actually maintained our revenues and carried on growing the fan base, which was great during COVID. And a lot of credit goes to my colleagues for scheduling, all the COVID bubbles and everything else. Because again, I just don't think people realise how long and how hard people had to work on that, because no one had ever done it before. And you're still doing it because you want to do the best you can for the teams and for the fans. And then coming out of COVID, we thought, okay, we've got a good chance. And this cost of living crisis, whichever way you look at it, whether it's through Ukraine, whether it's post-COVID fallout, has made it difficult. And if I look back onto my previous job as a marketing director in other companies, the one thing that you look at when times are tough, the sponsorship money is the first to drop and the last to come back. And I'll tell you that when I was in other companies, I would get calls from my chief exec or managing director and say, Dominic, you've got to go and cut these contracts because it's an indulgence. Now, I would always argue that sponsorship is not an indulgence, because if you do it really well, it's really powerful. And because sport is the one thing that people are guaranteed to watch on TV or on your mobile device, and it's the one thing that inflames passion, much more than butter or toothpaste or stocks and shares. It's just not, people want to talk about sport and their team. So where we are now, I think, look, we're having lots of conversations. What we're doing is, let me paint the picture briefly of where we are now. I mean, it's not all bad, and actually, in fact, quite the opposite. For 2021-22, it was our best ever year in terms of commercial revenues outside of broadcast, and broadcast is good. And when I say best ever, so we've actually doubled our revenues compared to 3.5 years ago. And if I was to do a sort of pie chart for you, or to spell it out, most sports teams, as you're probably aware, and probably some of the listeners are aware, is that rely on broadcast. So broadcast for us is about 70% plus of our revenues. So all your eggs are in the broadcast basket, albeit it's a pretty stable one. But so what you're really trying to do is see what the big ticket items for us, which make the difference, are sponsorship and ticket sales. And then you start to look at smaller items in terms of licensing and digital ad revenues and things like that. But if you don't get broadcast right, if you don't get sponsorship right, and if you don't get ticketing right, you're really struggling. So, and if I can just make that really relevant to West Indies fans listening, I think one of the things that I've heard or observed is that a lot of fans think that money gets wasted, or we're this big profit center we're generating money and it's going on to lots of sort of strange and indulgent activities. It's not the case at all. I mean, literally every dollar, whether it's EC dollar, Jamaican dollar, Guyanese dollar, TT dollar, Barbados dollar, goes into cricket. We want to be making a surplus so that we can reinvest. So if someone is watching a YouTube highlights package, the money that we make, which is not a lot of YouTube, as you guys probably know, but every little helps. It goes back into cricket, whether that's age group, participation, whatever the case may be. So I know I'm covering a lot of things, but what I'm to come back to the sponsorship point is, we know that the story is there, but I always try and explain it looking at the other side. Is if I was the Coca-Cola, or let's say the Pringles marketing director, and said, right, okay, I've got a sponsorship budget. Your first question is, are you going to sponsor? Your next question is, what's going to fit your audience? Is it sport? Is it music? Is it film? Is it something else? If you select sport, what sport is it? If you select cricket, within sport, what part of cricket are you going for? Are you going international tournaments or teams? If you finally settle on West Indies, then you've gone a long way down that decision tree to get there. And at any point, you could easily say, look, we're not going to spend on sponsorship, or we're going to spend on music, or we're going to go into football or F1 or something else. So it's up to us to make the strongest pitch possible and show that the fan base following West Indies is a really exciting and interesting fan base around the world. And that's actually the story which which works best for us. So, we got some active conversations at the moment, but, I would say both professionally and personally, it is a big frustration we haven't had someone on the front of the shirt consistently for the last, 12 to 15 months, I suppose. But at the same time, thankfully, so far, it hasn't caused us problems, because actually our other revenues are making up for that. So if we can actually get all of those, we've actually got a target to add 50% of those revenues again. And if we can do that, that means that we'll be strengthening cricket at every level, and particularly starting to put more into age group and participation cricket, which is the key thing we need to invest in to get the next generation of cricketers coming through.
Thank you for that, Dominic. And that was really in-depth. And funnily enough, just as you were ending that point there, because when I can't remember which series it was, and actually it might have been when our new ODI shirt came out, pre-sponsor, and Santoki actually put a picture up of it on our Twitter feed. And there was a lot of reaction to just wanting the shirt without a sponsor on it anyway, because in many ways, you kind of reference New Zealand rugby, but West Indies are iconic in the way that Barcelona are iconic. Mm-hmm. So actually, a no sponsor West Indies shirt probably sells for top dollar more than a sponsor's West Indies shirt. So there is that to bear in mind as well.
But we actually had that with the Test shirt in the summer for the was it the Bangladesh series, I think, and we brought in a new Test shirt, and social media was alight, going, where can I buy it? Where can I buy it? It's like, hang on, we've only just put it out there. We weren't quite sure how it was going to work. So, but we get people, when you get the West Indies across the front of the shirt, like you do for the World Cups, that in itself is really interesting, because some people just want West Indies on the shirt. But if you have West Indies on the shirt, you reduce the space for the sponsor, and the sponsor's less willing to pay that. So these are all the sort of balances you have that you're trying to weigh up.
Just something I wanted to ask. Again, I think this is about trying to dive a bit deeper and I guess connect some of the dots. You are commercial and marketing for Cricket West Indies, but how much of your job, I'm going to split it twofold here. How much of your job correlates with trying to get governments on side across the region? It may be nothing. I'm just intrigued. How much of it correlates to governments, and how much of it correlates with the individual territorial boards? So will they have their own commercial and marketing individual who you liaise with? Are you trying to get them to take best practice from yourself, or are you taking a more hands-on approach there, or is it a hands-off approach with regards to each of the different territories? There's a lot in that, but I'm just intrigued as to how that works.
I think we're, and I don't mean this patronizingly in any sense at all. I mean, we're here to help, and I think, look, fundamentally, we've pretty much got more resource, as you'd expect, as international cricket does relative to regional teams. So if you go to Australia, Cricket Australia's got more resource than, Victoria or New South Wales. Same in England. If you're going for Yorkshire or Kent or Surrey, is different to England. So both in terms of my experience, but especially in terms of the role we're trying to help and guide. I think most of the time we're really just trying to collaborate, because if we're working for events in Barbados or Trinidad or St. Lucia, or whatever the case may be, the local territorial board team has a lot more knowledge than we do. So essentially, we're just trying to create joint plans to make sure that we get the best of it. They certainly have their own focus on driving their own commercial returns for, let's say in the case of Barbados, for the BCA, and for the Barbados Pride, who are playing in Super 50, and all of Barbados cricket. If you're looking at the likes of the Leewards or the Windwards, which is obviously difficult because you've got multiple cricket associations to create a sort of regional association which feeds into Cricket West Indies, that's different again, because if you're in Antigua, you've got Antigua and Barbuda cricket who are trying to work with the Leewards, who are trying to work with Cricket West Indies. So you've got a three-way partnership, and the same with the Windwards as well. So So I think that everybody's learning, and I think I'm not sure exactly when it was. Someone said to me back in either late 1990s or early 2000s, Cricket West Indies was less than 10 people, possibly less than 7 or 8 people. And it was really about purely administering cricket. So if you think how rapidly the sport has commercialised for both Cricket West Indies and for the territorial boards, everyone's had quite a lot of catching up to do, which is obviously difficult if you don't have the size of population to bring in the commercial revenues to allow you to employ the right number of people to do so. So I hope that answers sort of one part of the question. I think to come back to government's side, I think a lot of my side is spent on time working with the likes of the tourist boards, to come back to the point I made earlier, which is, it's a great opportunity for us, particularly from a TV and digital perspective, to showcase each of the countries. So we work with the tourist boards, and we know that the tourist boards can help and use the West Indies. So, for example, I think the World Travel Market's on in London at the moment, and a number of the countries are using West Indies cricket imagery and some of the former players as well, to promote tourism to the region. So that's something that we will be heavily involved in. And I think increasingly, whilst it's not so much on my side, although I am involved, the likes of Jimmy Adams' team on the cricket side and the cricket development side, along with the CEO and the president, the vice president, and various board members, is working very closely with the governments because of the role that we know cricket can play, certainly economically, but also increasingly, certainly the last 5 to 10 years, maybe a bit longer, socially and in terms of health as well. And we all know in terms of, sugary foods and eating habits and increasing obesity rates is actually the role that sport can play in general in getting people healthier and active. And I think increasingly now is going to mental well-being, not just physical activity. So that's something that we are, I couldn't give you a percentage of it, but let's say if we're planning, let's say we got an India test series coming, an India all format series coming in 2023. So we'll have 2 tests, 3 ODIs and 5 T20s as it stands at the moment. Each of the tests is likely to be in a different venue. Probably 2 of the T20s will be in a venue, possibly 2, a T20 and an ODI will be in another venue. And then you'll have another 4 T20s. Sorry, I've got that wrong. 2 of the ODIs will be in a venue, 1 of the ODIs and the T20 will be in another venue. You've then got 4 more T20s, which you could either have in one venue or split into 2, because equally we've got to share cricket around the region. So in each of those venues, we're then working with the government to say, you've got all your security planning, you've got your ticketing, you've got your advertising advance, you've got your concessionaires trying to get local sponsors involved, and the list goes on. So I'm not sure I fully answered your question there, Mashal, but hopefully it gives a sense of, I can't give a percentage, but it just shows that all the different facets that we're working on all the time.
I was actually thinking that sounds like a stressful job. that's all that was going through my head. Sorry, Santoki.
Well, I think it still comes back. It still comes back to the fact, and I think that, listen, as a governing body, wherever you are in the world, and I know this, I've got friends at the NFA, I've got friends at the NFL, I've got friends in F1, working friends and just social friends. When you're in a governing body, you don't get any love. You get more love if you're representing a specific team. So whilst we are obviously representing and looking after West Indies, at the pinnacle of it, a lot of people think of Cricket West Indies, they're running cricket, but everyone no governing body in the world gets love, and that's just part and parcel of it. But the flip side is, it's a privilege, and I think everyone here that certainly I work with and I see really works hard because they just know what it matters to them as individuals, how it matters to friends and family, to their community. And I think that's often what people don't see, which is actually the long hours. And whilst we're never going to get everything right, you've got people who are fundamentally cricket fans and predominantly West Indians who love the game and love what it means to their region. So they work it really hard. It's just we happen to be called Cricket West Indies, and we administer the game when actually it's all about creating the love for the sport. So you're always going to get a cuss because it's sport. I'm quite realistic on that.
We talked about obviously different venues and sides touring. As a commercial director, it must have been frustrating to hear obviously England aren't going to be touring for any tests in the next future tours programs. In terms of sort of the revenue that brings, is it comparable to an India touring the West Indies, or is England touring the West Indies in terms of the revenue and finances it brings, just on its own sort of level for West Indies cricket?
India and England are probably the two big outliers commercially for us, and I'd say India's just a fact of the matter is the India tour is much more about broadcast revenue, and if you speak to my counterparts in Australia, South Africa, England, Bangladesh, wherever, everyone will say the same. Your India content really matters in terms of your broadcast revenues, and I mean, the great thing is we know how much the West Indies are revered in India, and with India expats around the world, and you see that in the amount of Indian expats who are in the States now and in Canada really enjoy coming to see West Indies and follow the India team as well. So what you need to have is the right balance of India and England content, because without that, we wouldn't survive. And that would be the same for Sri Lanka. It would be the same for Bangladesh. In the modern world, that is, because the cost of putting on a really good TV production and everything that goes with it in terms of players, officials, stadiums, everything that goes with that, it is expensive because players are demanding more. You need more safety. Fans want a better experience. You want good stadiums. All of these things have got to be invested in. Coming back to the England and India differential, England is different to India. England is still the second most important market for Cricket West Indies in terms of broadcast. But what England brings is obviously the travelling fans. And what England brings as well is some other opportunities for sponsorship and merchandise and everything else. So you take those two out of the equation, it's very difficult. But I think the one thing I was also going to say, obviously I'm an Englishman, but the one thing I would also say to West Indies fans is we are incredibly lucky in the Caribbean to be able to benefit from British tourism, English sports tourism, not just normal tourism. And I'm not saying that because I'm an Englishman. It's just, as you guys will know, in Britain, the English, Welsh, Scottish, Irish travelling fans are crazy and they follow their teams. And that doesn't happen in many parts of the world. And actually, it's just it's not luck, but we are fortuitous insofar as by having those travelling fans, once every 2 years, the economic boost is massive. And without it, again, we would have a hole. So, I mean, we wouldn't have known that 30, 40 years ago, but now it's really, really important. And I think, you see it again with the fans going to, yes, they've got the Barmy Army, but the rugby fans travel, the England fans travel numbers to the World Cup. So it's just something to be aware of, because it's just one of those lucky or incredible tribal community-based fan bases where they travel in massive numbers. And if you think, we had 6,000 or 7,000 here in Antigua, 6,000 or 7,000 people probably spending at least $100, $200 a day in Antigua for a week to 10 days before going on to Barbados or before going on to St. Lucia or wherever next. The actual additional economic benefits are huge.
Dominic, again, I can't put a timestamp on it, but I distinctly remember this conversation online once where you were responding either to us or probably more likely some other West Indies fans. But can you just break down when we travel? Is there any real commercial marketing benefit that we can get going elsewhere? Now, here's why I say this. I remember the context of what you said. So I think it may even have been the England. I don't know if it was the England COVID tour. I can't remember. But you made a comment that, and please correct me if I've got it wrong. If West Indies want to sell merchandise, it's dependent on the home board stocking the merch for people to buy. So the West Indies traveling staff, whoever that may be for any tour, it's not like a touring band. You can't just take a box of merch, set up a stall. And the reason why I say it as well, Dominic, is because when I went over to the Netherlands in the summer when West Indies travelled, the KNCB had a stall for Dutch merch, and there were loads of West Indian fans who had travelled over from the UK or in mainland Europe, and there wasn't anything there for West Indian fans. And at the time I was like, well, this is a missed opportunity. And then I remembered that you had said, well, actually, it's kind of dependent on what the home board chooses to do. Can you just break that down a tiny bit more?
Yeah, well, if I touch on the merchandise first and foremost, actually, let me just say we know that getting West Indies kits to people around the world and here in the Caribbean has always been tricky. And that's predominantly been because you've got two factors. One is generally the cost of a kit, particularly if you look at football shirts now, the cost of a kit is really quite expensive for a relatively thin piece of material if you break it down into very rational terms. And actually to ask someone to pay, 60, 70 US dollars for a kit, which is still on the cheap side, in an economic environment where you don't have a huge amount of people earning comfortable sums of money, as it were, it's very difficult to therefore get the business case to be able to import and export lots of kit to different parts of the world. The other, when it comes to merchandise itself, whether we're playing in the Netherlands or whether we're playing at Lord's, ultimately it comes down to the concessions that you have. So the concessions or the businesses that have stalls or booths or even permanent setups in those places, they still have to, they've got to pay a fee to the ground or to the home board to be able to be there, and then they've got to buy it off us. So we can't actively influence it. We obviously do try to influence it, and we work with the likes of our kit partners to say, look, you can buy stock from these people, you can even buy it from us direct, and then you've still got to ship it. That's on the merchandise side. So there are some barriers. We're trying to get over them. If you look at the bigger piece beyond the merchandise, fundamentally, when we go abroad, we do not make any revenue whatsoever, and it's been like that for a long time. So when we get any of the big countries, India, England, every home team keeps their home revenues in terms of ticketing, sponsorship, and TV. So, I'm just going to say, let's say our home revenues, for argument's sake, are $1,000 from an India tour. They're not, obviously, but if you went to India, their home revenues would be $100,000. So immediately you see the difference between one of the big boys and ourselves and the likes of New Zealand, Bangladesh, Zimbabwe, probably Pakistan to some degree as well, and South Africa. But that's because the home team gets the revenue, the home team negotiates the TV contracts, the home team negotiates the sponsorship for the series, Test, ODI, T20 series, the home board gets the ticketing and everything else. Now, indirectly, of course, we do get some revenue. So our partners, when it was with Sandals, but the likes of CG United as our insurance partner, Betway as our betting partner, MasterCard, where they've got the, some of them have branding on the shirts. They have year-round marketing rights as well. So there is that indirect piece, which is when we go away and when we're playing in a World Cup, we are getting revenues just by being out there and being visible and playing cricket and hopefully succeeding. But fundamentally, it's when we're at home, we generate revenue. When we're away, we're generating revenue because of who we are, but we're not directly generating revenue from any of those fixtures.
Now, we've talked about a lot of challenges and issues with sort of sponsorship in the region and all that, but it's only right sort of to wrap up to talk about if you look back at your 5 years in the role, what have stood out as sort of achievements or things you've looked back on and thought, I'm really, really proud of that?
I think there's probably two or three things, and myself with the wider team here. I mean, we've had I suppose we've helped put in place an attitudinal shift, and what I mean by that is, particularly on the commercial side, not just us but other companies were saying, well, look, here's your sponsorship package, and it consists of A, B, C, and D, and it has within box A you get 50 of these things, within box B you get 100 of these things. And we've completely changed that approach. So when we're talking to any partner or potential partner, whether they be in the region or not, we just say, look, it's a blank canvas. You tell us what you want to do, and we'll help to deliver a program with you that you can do. And that takes a big shift, because attitudinally you're used to people coming in and it's easy to sell a menu, but actually what any brand wants, any business, an insurance business is different to a soft drinks business, is different to a tourist business. So we have to be able to shape ourselves and be agile and work to that. So that's one. And that's intertwined. I think we've made a big inroads on the online and social side. We've still got more to do, but we've got a small team. I know you've done some work with some of them as well, but they work really hard and have helped, I think, really change our presence and our interaction as well. And I think that's one of the things, we really want to embrace all the interaction with fans, provide as much information as we can, share as much information predominantly on the cricketing side, but less so on the sort of corporate side. So the fact that you can now watch highlights of any home game pretty much within 6 to 8 hours on YouTube, all of our games there. We're still going to have a lot of our archive available, and our social audiences are growing really, really well. I think we're really excited by that. And I think the other thing is really on the commercial side as well. As I said, we've actually doubled the revenues, and whilst we don't have the sponsors there, what we do is we've got a larger family of sponsors now, who we think are pretty engaged and pretty excited by the possibilities. And I think, I know that's been one of the big achievements, to go from probably 1 or 2 sponsors in 2017 to probably 8 or 9 or 10 sponsors now, and the revenues. And I think for us as well, I think it's really telling the story. If we can start to tell that story better of the West Indies and help fans understand that when they buy a ticket or buy a shirt, that money goes directly into investment in cricket. That's really our next piece that we need to get, because I think more so than in most of the major sports, as I said, every dollar spent here on something to do with the West Indies fundamentally goes back into running tournaments or developing teams. And I think I'm not necessarily proud of that, but I think for me, it's a much more valuable and important connection, that you're not just selling, a can of something or a box of something. If you get the fans coming through the door and they buy a ticket, it ultimately sustains or strengthens Cricket West Indies. And I think that's actually our next big focus, which is, we know that the stadiums aren't as busy as they want to be. We know we want to have a better experience, but we really want to get that heartbeat. As we say, we say that cricket should be the heartbeat of the Caribbean. We want to get that heartbeat, that drum beat with all the music, the smells and the colours, really back into the stadium, particularly after 2.5 years with COVID and all of those struggles. We know it wasn't great before that, but that will be, the sign of strength for West Indies cricket fans, when you've got 75% full stadiums on a regular basis.
Most definitely, and I think I would just echo what you said earlier on in that I do think our social media presence has improved massively. I think, as you say, like the highlights package, but not even the highlights package. I mean, like the Instagram reels, the Twitter updates. I do think Santoki and I often laugh in so much as I don't think people realize just how transparent West Indies are with stuff compared to some of the other ports in terms of the access to the product, so to speak. So no, I actually do echo that. And before we wrap, Dominic, and go to the final question, Santoki and I have been looking at the finances behind the Caribbean Cricket Podcast, and I reckon if you need a sponsor for the West Indies shirt, I reckon we can give you 320 East Caribbean dollars per month to go on the front of the West Indies shirt. What would you say? Caribbean Cricket Podcast on the front of the West Indies shirt?
I'll send you the contract, but I might have to move the decimal points around.
Well, people, you heard it there. We're in negotiations. There's an outside chance he might get on the front of the shirt.
One of the things I will say, and I know we've had some conversations privately about this as well. I think that without just being sycophantic because you're here, I think you guys are doing a great job. And I don't mean that comparatively. I just mean one of the great things of the internet and technology has allowed people to interact and have opinions. And I think delivering opinions with balance is really, really important. And I think we also recognize that as wonderful as it is to have X million followers on our own channels, we want to, and we need to work with partners within the Caribbean and outside of the Caribbean to talk about cricket. I mean, we know we're going to get cussed sometimes. We know we're going to get, when things aren't well, it's, we know that we're going to get some negativity. It's just part of life. But I think equally the positivity and the balance of it matters. And I'd just like to say thank you to you guys. I know you're growing, but the opportunity to invite people in is really, really important. And, a lot of our team are watching you and some other media partners because we want to hear and see those conversations. And I think probably the summary to that point is, from a fan's perspective, we really want them to understand that we are listening. We look at the social feedback. We look at, the chat rooms and everything else. We may not always agree with it. Sometimes we do agree with it and put things into play. But I just want to say thank you for providing that accessibility and extending the conversation, because I think it makes a big difference.
Santoki, I don't know if we can accept that. Thanks. Dominic's trying to set us up so we get the cuss out instead of him. But no, thank you, Dominic. That's much appreciated. And ultimately, like you say, the one thing that drives everyone is ultimately a love for West Indies cricket in some shape or form. But listen, Dominic, before we wrap this, because we're coming to the top of the hour, we always end any podcast with a guest with the same way. So I'm going to give you the big final question that we give to all our guests. And this is important as well, because obviously you've been in the Caribbean for a while now. So everyone's going to be interested in your response. Of all the grounds you have visited in the Caribbean, on West Indies duty, whether behind the desk or in the grounds themselves, whatever you've been doing, which is the best ground to watch cricket in the Caribbean? And take your time, Dominic. Take your time.
I would say, this is. I'm going to get some fans somewhere and not going to be able to show my passport elsewhere on the back of this argument. Can I give you three answers?
Go for it.
Seeing the fans in. Actually, I was going to say, for a full Brian Lara, the Trinidadian fans, and actually the noise you get in Trinidad is fantastic. And to be back there for the India series this year, it's a shame we couldn't get over the line in that ODI series, because the fans there and the noise that was coming up was fantastic. obviously Queen's Park's got a lot of history, but seeing a full Brian Lara was great, particularly because we haven't had fans back in the stadium for a long time. I think CCG, which is obviously where we are as the West Indies High Performance Centre, is at the completely other end of that, because I think it's what I think is a really great sort of small international ground. You've got the banks, you've got some stands. When you've got a lot of people in there, you know, I never got to go to the old Antigua Recreation Ground in town in St. John's. But everyone told me that it felt like there were 50,000 people in there when there were just 4,000 people in there. And I think that's something, I think that's one of the things we want to look at here is when you get 3,000 or 4,000 people into CCG for a Super 50 game or for a women's game, it can feel really alive because it's banks and coolers and bring your mats to sit on. It's good fun. And I would say, I think an incredible stadium is Grenada. It's, the Grenadians may not like me saying this, I'm sure they'd agree that it's probably too big, but actually the noise and it's actually a great viewing stadium. And actually one of the things we probably don't appreciate, we've got some amazing cricket stadiums here in the Caribbean anyway, wherever you go, you know, big Sabina Park, you know, Kensington Oval, of course, Sir Vivian Richards here. But Grenada was great because you see what it means to the Grenadian fans. But the thing I will say, and I didn't go, but I'm going to say this secondhand from all of my team because I missed out on it. But the Dominicans to get cricket back this year after all the tribulations they've had following the hurricane in 2017, for a Bangladesh game, for a daytime Bangladesh game, to get a pretty full stadium, everyone said that it was a really great atmosphere. So hopefully I've covered my bases. I know I haven't covered Jamaica and Guyana properly there, and so hopefully I'll still be allowed into the countries. But
listen, Santoki, hold on. Santoki, before you come in, Dominic said he didn't go to Dominica. I just want to check. Is that because you saw you had to take a boat and you were like, nah, not me. I'm not taking that boat to Dominica.
I'd love to say that was the case. No, it's just a case of hopping around. But I think if I come back to where I started right at the start and the West Indies story, you know, winning against the odds, the players, the one thing that I think is really different, and I assume not many of the fans will know this because they may not have had the chance to visit overseas, but the Caribbean cricket viewing experience is so different. I mean, I've been lucky to go to South Africa and Australia and England, haven't done India, haven't done Sri Lanka or Pakistan, but the viewing experience here is just so different. It's so colourful, it's not noisy and fun. And I say it as an Englishman, as wonderful as Lord's is, it's not a fun atmosphere, it's an appreciative atmosphere. The Oval's different, the Edgbaston's a little bit different, Old Trafford, etc. But what you get here, you really get the sense it's the people's game in the Caribbean. And I think that is what is fantastic about the West Indies and those fans going to the stadium. So, I mean, we love it when we see it. That's why we want to get more fans in, because I generally feel that when you got 5,000 West Indians in a stadium, it feels like 25,000 people in another stadium in another part of the world. And, you know, that's what we're working so hard for.
Great. Well, Dominic, that's the end of the episode. We've been trying to get you on the show for a while now, and it's been worth it. I think you've answered all the questions, kind of broken it down, what fans want to know with honesty and transparency, as you continue to do on social media. I mean, your honesty even went so far as to come on the show and name your top 3 stadiums in the Caribbean, and not even stop and pretend to think about Jamaica or Guyana. But we'll forgive you for that. But Dominic, thank you very much for coming on.
Thank you very much. And one thing I'd say, I mean, you know, we'd encourage fans, if there's any other questions, go onto the website and, you know, you can see the email address. If you send through, and myself or our team will answer those questions. We're happy to. I know it's hard to be responsive quickly sometimes, and we know a lot of the fans because of history, think that we're sometimes hiding things, but whenever we can answer questions, we will. And, we want to engage, because fundamentally the team, in terms of the West Indies and the sport, is that of the fans. And we just want to make it the best experience for them and be as successful as we can to get them behind their teams.
Well, ladies and gentlemen, you couldn't put it any better there, Dominic. As Santoki says, thank you, Dominic, so much for coming on. Much appreciated. And ladies and gents, what can I say? That's been episode 76 of the Caribbean Cricket Podcast. As ever, follow us on the socials at Carib Cricket. Like, share, and subscribe to Caribbean Cricket Podcast. Thank you, and good night.
We rule the cricket world. Now the rule seems coming.
Welcome to the Caribbean Cricket Podcast, your one-stop shop for all things West Indies cricket. By the fans, for the fans.